Some sounds are imperceptible unless you're really tuned in. This is the sound of one man screaming. It's also the sound of one hand screaming. It's the bitter taste of one hop screaming. And it's not only the sound of 20 haunting years, but it's the sound of 40 haunting years. In this episode, I'm going to be talking all about my new book, One Hand Screaming, exploring some of the behind the scenes, some of the marketing, some of the reasoning behind all the sort of crazy things that I've done in relation to pushing this book in its book launch, including traditional distribution. And I'm also going to share some really cool, phenomenal marketing tools that I have come across that I thought you might benefit from hearing about. And that's all coming up in this solo episode of One Hand Screaming. Of Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 383 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Today's episode is a solo episode. I'm going to be talking all about One Hand Screaming, about my new book launch. I'm going to be sharing the behind the scenes, a little bit of the creation, the origin of the original version of it, as well as some marketing tools or tactics or strategies that you may want to consider. So yes, it's very self-indulgent, but I think there's going to be some content that you may find interesting and you may find might be able to apply to your own writing life. And so with that being said, I'm going to forego the various segments at the beginning of this episode, the bumpers, etc., and explain to you that the reason why I am doing this way is it is Tuesday, October 8th, and I am going to be on the highway much of the afternoon on Wednesday the 9th. I'm heading over to Ottawa, Ontario, about 4 to 6 hour drive, depending on how many times I stop and how much coffee I'm drinking along the way. Because on Thursday evening, I'm going to be doing a book launch, an Ottawa book launch for One Hand Screaming, and then I'm driving back on Friday. So a lot of the time that I would normally be spending working on the podcast, I wanted to do while I was in my home with the controlled environment, etc., and get that episode out the door. So let's play a bit of a bumper, because I do want to say a special thank you to the patrons and those who support this podcast, and then we'll get right into the main content. This podcast is sponsored by all the awesome folks who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections, as well as those who support me over at buymeacoffee.com/markleslie. I just want to say a huge shout out and a huge thank you to everyone who supports this podcast in such a way. I really appreciate what you guys are doing to help support and prop up the podcast, and I do hope that I'm able to pay it forward in the proper way to provide extra content for my listeners, for my patrons, and for my coffee buddies, because I want to be able to not only provide you guys extra content, I also want to be able to provide, in general, great content for the community. And your generosity and your support not only means so much to me personally and emotionally, and something that really just warms my heart and makes me not want to give up, but it's also something that I hope to be able to give back to the community in as many ways as possible. So again, a huge and gigantic shout out to all of those who support this podcast financially. And if you're listening to the podcast and you enjoy the podcast, and I understand it's not easy, to yet another few dollars here and there, There are other ways you can support the podcast. Leave comments on episodes and engage in the conversation. That's great. That engagement is really valuable to me, and it means a lot actually to hear what you're thinking of, what you're reflecting on when you listen to the podcast. And I do like engaging in those and sharing your comments. I'm actually considering trying to figure out a way for you to share audio comments so we can actually hear your voice, which I think might be even better than having me read your comments or sometimes misread your comments. Other ways is you can leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. That's always important. That always helps. We as authors know that. That's a very important element. But, one of the best ways is you can share episodes with people that you think would find value in them. Say like, hey, there's a great interview with so-and-so, or this one particular solo episode, I really like what Mark had to say about X, Y, or Z, or Z, depending on where you are in the world. I'm kind of in Canada, we kind of lean more towards Z, but we can have a Z. We can have a Z every once in a while. In any case, just want to say appreciation to all y'all who are listening to this podcast, as well as those of you who support this podcast. I couldn't do this without you, and I'm serious when I say that, because just having you there listening, that's an important aspect. It's knowing that there's people out there who are interested and engaged and wanting to reflect and wanting to grow as writers, just like I want to continue to grow as a writer. So, love having you on the other end. Thank you so much. Let's roll the bumper and let's get into the meat of this episode.
Silent screams bounce around my head like an impending storm, brewing into a force that will escape in a wild dance of chaos and be lost forever if I don't stop to write them down.
The bumper you just heard was actually the introduction to a podcast that I initially launched back in 2006, and it only lasted until 2011, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I launched that podcast as a way to promote the only book I had at the time, which was the book One Hand Screaming. But I want to get into the origin of why I put together the original book, One Hand Screaming, and published it in 2004. The new version, the 20th anniversary version, which I'll get to as well, is the subtitle is 20 Haunting Years. But when I actually reflect on it, it's been 40 haunting years since I started my journey into the writing world. I got my very first short story rejection in 1984 at the age of 15. I'm 55 years old now, so that means 40 years of rejections, 40 years of being serious about writing. Now, the very first short story was a short story called Nullification. It has never been published, and for good reason, because it's not that great of a story. But it was my very first story. And that story was something I submitted to a CBC radio contest, a literary contest. And I should have known not to send speculative fiction to a literary contest. But the story was born out of an assignment we had to write for English class. I think we had a teacher who was very concerned and interested in peace and pacifism and Amnesty International, etc. And we had a group of students come in to talk at our high school, Levac District High School, just north of Sudbury, Ontario. And they talked about nuclear disarmament. And we ended up talking a lot after they'd come to visit the school about the dangers and the fears. And there's quite a bit of fear about nuclear war and the possibility of nuclear war back in those days. And I remember reading up on, and there had to have been at least an assignment where we looked at the effect, like radiation poisoning and all the side effects of nuclear war. And in considering Sudbury being the nickel capital of the world, we were a 45-minute drive north. So 50, 60 kilometers northwest of this city. We were just on the outside of the radius of the bomb blast that would completely destroy Sudbury. Because, of course, that would be one of the targets, right? You would want to hit the infrastructure. You'd want to hit factories. You'd want to hit where you mine the resources like nickel. So you'd probably hit, obviously, Hamilton, because that's where they manufacture steel. You'd hit a place like Sudbury. In any case, we were about 45 minutes northwest of Sudbury, and so I wrote the story that basically explores the side effects of a nuclear bomb blast and what that would mean. And of course, I tried to incorporate all of those learnings in the story and just show the horrific nature of nuclear war. In any case, it was one of those wake-up stories, and then of course you find out it's all a dream, but then the twist surprise ending is that he wakes up again and then he hears the exact same thing on the radio, the exact same song he heard when he first woke up, and then he hears the announcement that there's been an attack. And that's how the story ends. And so, twist ending. Of course, probably the kind of twist ending that's been done thousands of times. I submitted that off to CBC Radio. I got it rejected. But that's when it all started. It was in 1984, at the age of 15, my very first rejection. And I got hundreds and hundreds of rejections after that. My very first short story finally was published in 1992. It was a young adult piece, a humorous piece actually, called The Progressive Sidetrack. And I wrote that for a grade 13 assignment. We had such a small high school that there was only one English class, whereas in other places there were different kinds of English classes for grade 13 because big populations. But we only had enough students in our school, 300 students in our school, to there's one English class. So I wanted to take an English creative writing class, and I did it by correspondence. Yes. This was back pre-internet days where I would mail assignments back and forth. And my teacher was in Toronto, which is about a 4 or 5 hour drive south of Sudbury, although it was 6 hours back then when the highways were a lot slower. There weren't the 4-lane highways as far north. And that hopefully shows you the commitment I had to wanting to become a better writer. I did everything I could to learn the craft of writing and to become better at it. But there was an assignment I had written for that class, and I remember my teacher reading it saying, I've never seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but this kind of reminds me of what it might be like, because it concerned a high school student who was cutting class and stuff like that to get some stuff done, and ultimately to try and ask this girl he had a crush on for a date, based completely on my own experiences as president of the student council, because I constantly had to get out of classes because I had to go take care of things when I was running the student council back then. And so the Progressive Sidetrack was a YA humor piece published in Chapter 1 magazine, which was basically a magazine, a digest, was specifically for unpublished writers. So they were only accepting you if you had never made a professional sale before. So that was my very first sale. I think I made $25 US, and I got a contributor's copy of that book, which I still have and is very precious to me. More rejections rolled in. My very first horror story was published in 1993, and that story was Phantom Mitch, and it's a horror story that explores the concept of a phantom itch, which I read stories about people who've had a limb amputated can sometimes feel a phantom itch on the limb that no longer exists. Well, I speculated what might happen if that limb was in another plane. And so in the case of the story, the main character, Barry, is in a car accident, and he was drunk driving. His wife died in the car accident, and he lost his arm. And so both his wife and his arm are in the afterworld, and with his arm and hand in the other world, he can actually touch and feel his wife, whose name was Michelle, nicknamed Mitch, and there's the play on words for Phantom Mitch. That story was published in Wicked Mystic magazine number 22 in 1993, and it also received honorable mention in the year's Best Fantasy and Horror, edited by Ellen Datlow and Terry Windling. And that was quite an honor, of course, that my very first horror story received that mention. But in any case, that was the beginning of getting my stories published in numerous small press magazines. And I would get paid anywhere from, half a cent a word to 5 cents a word. Well, no, not quite 5 cents a word yet, because 5 cents a word US was the professional rates back then for a short story. But I would make anywhere from half a cent a word to maybe 3 cents a word. So that could mean I'd be making anywhere from $25 to $150, for a 5,000 word story, if I did the math correctly in my head there. And I was slowly building up my brand as an author because, again, you got to remember this started off pre-internet days. And the going wisdom for writers was you would submit your stories to markets. You would start off in small markets and work your way up slowly to the bigger markets and the bigger markets and the bigger markets. And eventually, once you had enough of a credit, once you had enough, of publications under your name, then when you sent your manuscript or you sent something to an editor or a publisher, you had a track record. You could say, well, my stories have been published here, there, and I've received honorable mention in the year's best fantasy and horror, etc. And so that was the going wisdom at the time. And I was working in the book industry. I started working in the book industry also in 1992, the same year that first short story was published. And people would come into the bookstore and they'd look around. They'd find out I was a writer. And say, you're a writer? Yeah, I'm a writer. And they'd look around the store and say, well, where can I find your stuff? As if they might find a book that had my stories in it in the store. And that was so frustrating for me because I had all these stories published. I had earned money. In 2001, by the way, I made my very first professional sale. It was a young adult. Again, young adult. Young reader, actually. It was younger. Science fiction story. And I don't really write science fiction. I tend to write more macabre, horror kind of stuff. I don't really lean into science fiction, but this was for Julie Tornado was the editor of Stardust, and this was based on the Ontario grade 4 science curriculum. So I picked something from a grade 4 textbook and said, okay, I'm going to write about properties of light. I'm going to write a story about that and make it interesting for kids. So a teacher in the classroom, this is what they're meant for, could use the stories to introduce the concept, in my case, properties of light and how light refracts, and there is a delay with the refraction that the light actually bends and also can slow down when it's passing through different mediums. So I ended up using that to create this slow glass kind of concept where you could actually look back in time a few minutes, and they end up using it to solve a mystery. So it was a fun story, but that was my first pro sale. But I had a few pro sales at that point. I had a whole bunch of stories published, but no book to show for it. So I decided in 2004 to collect a bunch of my previously published stories, as well as a few that hadn't been published yet, and make them available in a book format. And I used Ingram Lightning Source, which is the print-on-demand solution behind what Ingram Spark is a very user-friendly front end, but Lightning Source was a back end, and it's the back end that powers a lot of print-on-demand. So Lightning Source powers Ingram Spark. Lightning Source powers draft-to-digital print. Lightning Source powers B&N Press print books. Lightning Source even does some overruns when their own printers can't keep up. They'll leverage the printers that Ingram has around the world. And there's probably 1,000 other print-on-demand companies that aren't really printing the books themselves. They're just using Ingram because Ingram's printers are probably the largest in the world, the largest network of printers around the world. They're also the ones that power the espresso book machine, but that's a whole other story. And I did have one of those machines in a bookstore that I managed years ago at McMaster University. I've probably talked about it a few times on the podcast, but the espresso book machine, you could load stuff to the machine and then get it into the system, and then it would end up being available. The Ingram through Ingram Lightning Source would be available to any espresso book machine. So almost any book you could get print on demand from Ingram, you could get off these machines, which is kind of cool. It allowed me to go to bookstores wherever I found an espresso book machine. I could order any one of my books that I knew were in Ingram print on demand. But anyways, I made the book one hand screaming. It was about 156 pages. I even went with really small print to try and cram it down to make the page count as low as possible to keep the cost down. I made the book fully returnable, full discount, available to bookstores, and fully returnable, which meant when I first launched the book, I was able to call up bookstores and say, hey, I remember, for example, traveling through the U.S., and I was going to be in Philadelphia for a week doing some training. And I reached out to a Barnes & Noble that was a downtown location and said, hey, got this new book out. I know you're a downtown location because I worked in the book industry. And I'm happy to come in and do some lunchtime signings as well. So if you're out in the suburbs or on the outskirts of the city, that would be evenings or weekends. And usually a downtown location, they get busy traffic at lunchtime. Because I had worked in bookstores on the outskirts of town as well as downtown locations. And I knew when the busy times were when the customers came in. And I was able to do that because they could bring in 20 copies of the book, and I would come in. And usually when I did a book signing, I'd sell at least half, if not more. And I was able to do that. Now, then it was a few years later that my first traditionally published book deal with a small publisher. I edited a science fiction, fantasy, and horror anthology, and then another anthology I edited for a different traditional publisher. And then my first book, standalone book that was me writing my own stuff, was nonfiction. It was Haunted Hamilton, but that wasn't until 2012. But I started self-publishing in 2004 with One Hand Screaming, just as a way to get my books out there and to try to market and build my brand as an author. And I'm proud to say I was doing it, almost 10 years before all the cool kids discovered it. Now, this was back in the day when it was embarrassing. The advice I got from most writer friends was, do not self-publish. It's the best way to kill your career before it even starts. And having worked in the book industry since 1992, I can attest, I wanted to support other writers when I was a bookseller. I wanted to bring in local books. I wanted to talk to local authors. And I did bring in on consignment self-published books. And I'll be honest with you, 9 out of 10 of them were horrible. They were absolute crap. I'm sorry. The reason self-publishing had a bad name was because, oftentimes this was not edited and the cover was horrible and nothing about it was right. We've come such a long way with the professionalism that's available as the technology has continued to advance. But back in the day, even though I was an author and a self-published author, I still had a bias against self-publishing. So I paid my best friend Steve Gados, who's a graphic designer. We had a company when we were kids, Stark. This is where Stark from the podcast comes from. Stark Publishing was the name of the company I registered in 2004, but it's based on a childhood dream Steve and I had when we were kids. Steve always wanted to be an animator, and I wanted to be a writer, and we thought one day we'll have a company called Stark Entertainment, and I'll write stories, and you'll do the animation for them, and it'll be a great teamwork, and we'll build this amazing company up. That's when we were probably 14, 15, 16. In our college years, when we were both in Ottawa, I was at Carleton University, Steve was at Algonquin College, and we DJ'd. So we created, the first time we used that Stark name was, I even had business cards created. This was like late 80s, early 90s. We had Stark Entertainment. It was a DJ company. I even still have some of the business cards from that. And we DJ'd. We did teen dances, we did weddings, we did Christmas parties, company parties and stuff like that. We loved it. It was great. This was on cassette tapes, and we didn't even own all the equipment. We just owned the music, and we would rent the speakers and the mixing board. And so let's say if somebody paid us, $350 for the night for the two of us, and it maybe cost us $100 to rent the equipment, or we get $500 and whatever. We didn't end up with a lot of money in our pockets, but it was really a fun experience. So Stark was the company, and the name Stark came from Steve and Mark. Steve got the first 2 letters, I got the last 3 letters. So that's where that came from. So Steve created the Stark Publishing logo for me, and again, this was for the price of a case of beer, $24 back in the day, 24 beers, $1 each for a case of beer. That's all it cost. And Steve also did the cover for One Hand Screaming. He incorporated. There was a skull. My wife at the time, Francine, her grandmother had drawn when she was in college. I never met her, but Agnes just seemed to be. I think we would have gotten along smashingly well. At least that's what Francine's mother, who I also got along with so well. And you're not supposed to get along with your mother-in-law, but we got along so well. Francine's mom gave me a framed picture of a skull that Agnes had drawn. Her mother Agnes had drawn when she was in college, and I still cherish it to this day. I kept it in front of my writing space, and so Steve incorporated my eye on the cover with the skull. You can see it very subtly reflected in my eyeball, and then the back of the cover shows a bit more of that skull. So that was One Hand Screaming. Like I said, because of the way I was kind of pushing the envelope with publishing it, it helped me to continue to build my brand. And then let's fast forward to, well, actually, before I fast forward, I did the podcast that you heard the teaser from, the Prelude to a Scream. So that podcast I launched on June 8th, 2006. And that was the first time I had purchased music from Kevin MacLeod of Incomptech.com, whose music I pay for this use in this podcast. And I'd started the podcast June 8th, 2006. My final episode was May 31st, 2011. So again, podcasting before all the cool kids, or most of the cool kids started it. But I only did 18 episodes in all those years. So it was a fun experiment. And in it, I read some of my short fiction. And it was just a way to try to sell my work. It was a way to try to get my work out there and have more people discover it. So anyways, let's flash forward 20 years. So 20 years, I'm coming up on the 20th anniversary of One Hand Screaming, and I thought, I need to do something to celebrate. I've also, something else that just kind of blows my mind is, I don't really launch books. With One Hand Screaming, I did a big book launch in Sudbury. It was a huge event. Both newspapers had covered it. The radio station sent people out to talk to me. I was interviewed on the local radio prior to the release of the book. I had a lineup of people out the door at the chapters in Sudbury when I was doing One Hand Screaming, and I haven't. With 30 odd books out, I write the book, I publish the book, I move on to the next thing. I don't make much of a fuss. So I wanted to make a fuss because this was a special anniversary. And so I did. I did the Kickstarter for it, which I'll talk about in a second. And I wanted to do a special edition. I thought, okay, I've got 20 more years of stories that I should collect and see the best of the best. And again, I had to kick out some stories that I thought were great, but they weren't horror. I wanted this to be horror. I added additional poetry. I even wrote an additional poem specifically for this edition as a parallel to the poem I wrote. The Sound of One Man Screaming was a poem I wrote that appeared in One Hand Screaming. So I have that in the 20th anniversary edition, but I also have another poem called 20 Haunting Years, which kind of reflects back to me being a kid at 15 writing in Levack, Ontario, and then being a kid writing in Ottawa, and then being a kid writing in Hamilton, and then being in Hamilton and launching One Hand Screaming, etc., etc. So I wanted to do that progression. But the 20th anniversary edition also has an additional, I commissioned 10 original artwork pieces to do full-page spreads. That the trade paperback only has a single-page spread, the hardcover and the deluxe edition have the full-page spreads. I also have an additional 26 stories, 11 of which have never been published anywhere before, so I wanted to have some unique stuff, especially if somebody had purchased the book. All 500 people who purchased the first book over the years, I wanted them to have something new and fresh, so it was properly a second edition or 20th anniversary edition of the book. And it was just, I wanted to celebrate, but I also wanted to push the boundaries again. I wanted to do a big launch event, which I'm doing. I've done a book event in person. I'm doing a whole bunch of them, and I'm even doing a mini tour. I wanted to do more, but I'm such a procrastinator. I didn't time it early enough, and so I am still doing a handful of events at bookstores over the next several weeks and driving around the province of Ontario a lot. But in addition to the special edition, I wanted to do something more. So I partnered with Ed Willett of Shadowpaw Press, who has a partnership, who has an account with Lit Disco and Fraser Direct, which are sales reps in a warehouse here in Ontario, Canada. And I rented some space from him to get this book into the warehouse. And the sales reps 6 months before the book is ready to go, they were out there because I had all the metadata in place and I knew it was coming out in October, and they were pitching this to bookstores in the spring of 2024. And as I can go online and look at, there's a website with indie bookstores in Canada. I'll have a link to it at starkreflections.ca. I can see which independent bookstores in Ontario, or Canada for that matter, have it on order and how many of them already have it in stock and stuff. So that's a really great exercise. And it's obviously an example of just how amazing the sales reps were at getting bookstores to order this book, because I didn't reach out to them. And again, the margin I will make on these is minimal. It's pretty much the same as what I would make on a traditionally published book, except I didn't get an advance, etc. But it's definitely worthwhile because it allows that it's a more scalable solution. Therefore, it's going to bring in a little bit less money for me. The other challenge is I had to drop $3,000 to do the first print run. And to get these copies, 200 copies into the warehouse, 100 copies for myself to do at various events that I'm doing. And that's expensive. And so that's one of the reasons I ran a Kickstarter in late summer. I meant to run it. Again, I wanted to run it much earlier than I did. I ended up being delayed on that for a variety of reasons, getting my master's, getting married, all the other things that were going on. But that Kickstarter helped me have some funds to pay the credit card bills so that I could do the print run and not be in the hole. And so huge appreciation to my Kickstarter supporters. I also tried to add as many of the various digital aspects into the rewards as possible, because the cost on that is a lot less, right? If I have to print a physical copy and ship it, there's the cost of shipping, there's the cost of printing, there's the labor involved, etc. If it's just a digital device, bam, it's in your hands right away. But on top of that, I wanted to do something really special, and I love beer. I love books and I love beer, and so collaborating with Counterpoint Brewing was a dream come true. I had Juan Pedron, who's my designer for the book cover, as well as so many of the other books that I do. Had him design a logo, a label for the beer. And I worked with Graham at Counterpoint, very small brewer, and I wanted to work with a small business because I'm a small business and I wanted to support another small business. We did the collaboration beer. It was an amazing process. And, I also wrote a special short story. Initially, it was supposed to be called One Hop Screaming, but I think I changed the name of the story as I was writing it to As One Hop Screams. And it's a horror story about a haunted beer, or a haunted brewery, however you look at it, or a haunted brewer. and there's a lot of Easter egg nods in it to beer friends. And, Graham is a character, one of the regulars who comes into this brewery. And the main character is Ben, the owner-manager of Arabella Beer Park in Kitchener, where I'm going to be doing a major event on the 29th. And it was just a fun, cheeky, old-style, like kind of creep show sort of story of revenge, ghostly revenge, etc. And it's about 5,000 or 6,000 words, and it's available. So there's a little QR code on the beer can. So, and there's a note about this is in collaboration of the release of Mark Leslie's 20th anniversary edition, One Hand Screaming, yada, yada, yada. More information here. And then you scan the barcode, and that takes you to onehandscreaming.com/onehopscreaming. And from there, using BookFunnel, you can download the free story. Hey, I'll include a link to it in the show notes, because it's not like you have to buy the beer to read the story. But then, of course, that has a link to the book where you can buy it direct from me and get a coupon and get it at a discount as well. So that's part of that marketing and promotion. And I thought, okay, cool. Some people will be drinking the beer. It's not like the beer is going to be distributed across Canada or anything. That's next, maybe. Who knows? But the whole idea was to get it out there in a way that people could, drink the beer and go, oh, look, a fun beer story. And especially if they're at a brewery by themselves, take your phone out, scan it, free app from BookFunnel. Here, now you got the ebook there. And when I do the audiobook, I will do an audiobook version of it. Be able to download the audiobook too, and I'll probably just read that myself. So I have that. I also created some promotional stuff. So some swag. So I made coasters. I made a 2-sided coaster. On the one side, it has the eye from One Hand Screaming, and the revised version. So what I did, and I have to backtrack because I forgot to mention this, is Steve did the original cover. It was beautiful. I loved it. I still use the Stark logo he designed, but I wanted to do a revised version for One Hand Screaming for the new one. So I took a new photo of my eye, the same eye, 20 years later. I sent it to Juan. I sent him the original cover, and I said, hey, let's put a skull in the eye. Let's make it kind of creepy. Here's kind of what I want to do with the effect. And I even asked him to use the same sort of fonts that he uses for my Canadian Werewolf series, just because it added some continuity there for some of my fans who might even recognize that. Even the Canadian maple leaf pattern that he has in the letters, and then of course my hand photo of my hand I sent him. And he incorporated that. He even added blood to my eye, so he made it even more disturbing. So I got that cover done, and so that eye is very prominent, and I've done some promotional stuff with it. So back to the coaster, that's on the front. You got the eye, onehandscreaming.com, etc. I think markleslie.ca as well. And then on the flip side, you have One Hop Screaming. You have the beer, One Hop Screaming. And again, Juan designed the beer label with a hop that looks like a skull. Now, I secured the licensing for that skull from Adobe through my Adobe account, where I can license images, and I actually adjusted it. I didn't like the shape of it, so I kind of played with the original image and then gave that to Juan, and then he created the beer label. And so the back of the coaster itself has the beer label and Counterpoint Brewing logo, and then it also has the QR code and says, a free story download here. I also made stickers for the beer as well, to give out as well. And I even made beer mugs, and I stole this idea from my friend Kevin Anderson, who did this with one of his Kickstarters. So my beer mug is a 16-ounce beer glass, and on the one side it has Juan designed a special, transparent black only logo instead of the color, because I didn't want to have to pay all the fees, because it was very expensive to do color on the beer glass. It has that logo on the one side. It has Counterpoint Brewing, and then on the other side it says "Thirsty for a beer and a Mark Leslie story." And so I thought, cool, what a great way to promote that. At the book launch at Counterpoint on October 2nd, people were there. They were buying the beer. They could buy the book and the beer and get a discount and save $5 if they bought them both. And we surprised everyone by, you would also get a free glass that you could take with you. And Graham was great about storing them for me, because I had to buy a lot of them to get a good price. And that's a cool bonus to do that. So the other thing too, and this even happened on the night of the launch, and Graham just sent an email to me earlier today saying, this has been a great partnership, because I've gotten new customers coming into my brewery because they came for your event or they want to come and check out the beer. So thank you for that. But also, the night of my event, we had few regulars, 3 or 4 regulars, who, the brewery is not normally open that night this time of the year. And it was open for my event, and of course open to the public for anyone to come in. So they came in and they were curious, and they tried the beer because it was just tapped that night, and ended up buying the book that I signed for. So I got new readers out of it. And that's the beauty of this collaboration, is we're supporting one another and we're getting each other new readers, etc. So that's some of the promotional stuff that I'm doing. Again, I'm doing some book events at chain and indie bookstores. I'm not just going to limit it to October. I'm going to do this through the month of November where I can, to do more events, because I know the book is going to be available, and I want it to be available for people to say, oh, I know someone who likes scary stories. I want to buy it for Christmas. So that's where it's beginning. But I'm going to take a bit of a breather here, going to play just a regular bumper, and I'm going to get back into some experimental marketing tools I've been using that I think you guys might benefit from. So here are some interesting marketing tools I discovered. And the first one I want to share with you, I heard about from Joanna Penn. As a patron of her podcast, she sent something out a couple weeks ago now about this. And I tried it out immediately. I woke up with plans to get stuff done in the morning, and of course saw the email from Jo when I opened up my email, which I shouldn't have opened up my email right away, but I was so thrilled. And she shared it's a Notebook LM, so notebooklm.google. Right now it's sort of beta, it's an early test, and it's a really great tool for generating marketing style content and summary style content for your book. So what I did is I loaded a few books. I loaded One Hand Screaming. I loaded the very first, A Canadian Werewolf in New York, and I loaded Wide for the Win. And there's several resources that you can get from this. So for example, I'll just give you an example. So I loaded it, and I can send in a prompt, and here are some of the notes that I got from that. So for example, if I look at, this is one of the saved responses from One Hand Screaming, right? So this is just the text that gets spit out. And so common themes in Mark Leslie's works. Based on the sources provided, here are some common themes found in Mark Leslie's work. And so this is something that's spit out probably, within 30 seconds or a minute of me loading the book and sending that prompt in. So the common themes, the allure and influence of books. The sources emphasize Leslie's deep connection to literature. Several excerpts suggest that books are not mere objects, but hold a kind of power, shaping individuals and even transcending the boundaries of life and death. The opening story, The Exquisite Taste of a Book-Aged Skull, uses the striking image of a skull as a vessel for imbibing the essence of books, highlighting their perceived ability to impart knowledge and shape character. The dedication to Sean Costello further emphasizes the importance of mentorship and shared passion within the writing community. In Silent Screams, 20 years later, Leslie reflects on his lifelong dedication to writing, stating that almost every single career choice and life choice I've made has involved being as close to books, publishing, and the writing life as possible. All right, so the next theme that it highlights is confronting fear and the unknown. The titles and descriptions of various stories, such as Nocturnal Visions, The Shadowmen, and From Out of the Night, suggest a recurring exploration of fear, darkness, and the unexplainable. The excerpt from Out of the Night explicitly states, "We are pursued from out of the night by dreams of the unknown and visions of the unexplainable, the unreal." In Silent Screams, 20 years later, Leslie admits to being still afraid of the monster under his bed, the boogeyman hiding in his closet, indicating a willingness to engage with these primal fears in his writing. Several story descriptions also mention exploring the darker side of what if, hinting at a fascination with the potential for horror in everyday situations. Another theme? The power of imagination and belief. Many of the story descriptions suggest a blurring of the lines between reality and fantasy, where belief itself can shape perception and experience. The excerpt from Out of the Night suggests that the inability to disprove the existence of something allows fears to persist and haunt us. The Exquisite Taste of a Book-Aged Skull implies that the protagonist's belief in the power of the book-aged skull influences his experience. In Silent Screams, 20 years later, Leslie states that horror is an emotion rather than a genre, further emphasizing the subject nature of fear and the power of belief. Another theme, reflections on humanity and relationships. While horror is a significant element, the sources indicate that Leslie's work also explores human relationships and the complexity of human nature. So, etc., etc. Experimentation with genre and format is another theme. The table of contents reveals a diverse range of formats, including short stories, flash fiction, poetry, and micro stories, showcasing Leslie's willingness to experiment with different forms of storytelling. The inclusion of humorous elements within horror stories, as mentioned in Silent Screams 20 years later, further suggests a playful approach to genre conventions. The section titled 13 Twitter Tales, Fear in 140 Characters or Less, highlights Leslie's engagement with microfiction and the creative constraints of writing within a limited character count. So this is just an example of a note that was pulled out of a prompt by saying, okay, look at the text for my book and tell me some stuff. There's the relationship between, this is another one, the relationship between the sound of one man screaming and silent screams. There's just so much going on. But what I want you to do, what I want you to hear is this. This is an automated conversation that sounds kind of like a morning radio program conversation or a podcast conversation of two people talking about my book. It's about 95% accurate in terms of what they're saying. And what's interesting is I'm a little bit frustrated that I misinterpreted one or two elements, but that's okay because I've had people review my books and I had so many different, podcast interviews, etc., where obviously the host didn't get it. They misinterpreted something or they remembered it differently than it was. So this is just fascinating because it was an automatic conversation about my book that was generated in the manner of about... Can you hear Indy, my dog? Can you hear Indy whining in his sleep? Hey, buddy, you're having a bad dream. He's having a bad dream because I'm talking about scary things. But anyways, this from Notebook LM is a clip you're going to hear, and it's a conversation about One Hand Screaming, and I thought you guys might benefit from checking that out.
Ever opened a time capsule, like packed with old photos and memories and stuff? Well, that's kind of what we're doing today, but instead of yearbooks, it's horror stories.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
Yeah, we're diving into Mark Leslie's One Hand Screaming.
Classic.
Right. But here's the thing. It was first published 20 years ago, and now there's this revised and expanded edition.
Oh, wow. So it's like a double dose of chills.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is seeing how the stories, but also like the author himself, have changed over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I'm not into the same things that scared me as a kid,
Totally. So we're going to dig into all that, how our relationship with fear kind of morphs. But first, a little background on Mark Leslie and this whole One Hand Screaming thing for anyone who might not be familiar.
It's a pretty evocative title, that's for sure. Sticks with you.
Totally does. And in these new introductions to the stories, Leslie really reflects on his younger self, the writer he was back then.
Oh, I always find that fascinating. It's like they're having a conversation with a ghost, but the ghost is their own past.
Right. And you can see how he's shifted, like maybe away from pure horror and more into psychological thrillers.
Which makes sense, right? Like, as we get older, the things that scare us change. The monsters under the bed become, well, like our actual lives and anxieties.
It's so true. And Leslie, he really taps into that. Like, remember how freaked out you were by, like, the dark when you were little?
Oh, tell me about it. I used to think there were monsters under my bed.
Right. But now it's probably more like, I don't know, deadlines. Or that weird noise your car's making.
Don't even get me started on that weird noise. See, Leslie gets it.
He totally gets it. It's like that saying, we fear what we don't understand, right? As we grow, those fears, they just become more internal, more about like the darkness inside us than spooky shadows.
Totally. And speaking of shadows and darkness, there's this one recurring motif in Leslie's work that's both creepy and kind of cool. Skulls.
Oh, yeah. Especially that story, The Exquisite Taste of a Book-Aged Skull.
Even the title. Right. So good.
It's like, what does it even mean for a skull to be book-aged? Like, is he saying knowledge can, like, seep into our very bones or something?
It's such a cool concept, though, right? This idea that the things we learn, the stories we consume, they literally shape who we are, like in a physical way. I love it.
And Leslie doesn't shy away from that, from like the physicality of it all. There's the scene where the main character, Herb, he's soaking a skull in bourbon.
Whoa. Okay. That's intense. What's he doing that for?
It's like he's trying to, I don't know, extract something from it. The essence of a life lived, maybe. It's both repulsive and fascinating at the same time.
Okay, yeah, I get it. Like, how far is too far in our search for knowledge, for understanding? Are we all just kind of picking at the bones of the past, trying to make sense of things?
And sometimes that search takes us to some dark places, which is where Leslie really thrives. He doesn't just do, like, your typical haunted house stuff.
No, he goes deeper, right? Like, into the really messed up stuff our brains can come up with.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to get a little weird with it, too.
Oh, yeah. Like that story, Twitter Tales. Who would have thought you could make Twitter scary?
It's like those bite-sized nightmares you scroll past at 2 a.m.,
And they just stick with you. He's good.
But it's not all like, weird skulls and Twitter. Leslie also writes about those like primal fears we get, the ones we carry with us from being kids.
Oh, totally. Like being afraid of the dark. Or is that just me?
No way. We've all been there. And Leslie, he takes that fear, that feeling of being watched when you're alone, and he just like cranks it up to 11.
Yeah, like in erratic cycles. That one messed me up.
Right. You're out in the woods, no cell service, and suddenly every snapping twig sounds like, I don't know, a monster or something.
Or a serial killer.
Ugh, don't even. See, that's what I love about Leslie stuff he gets, that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't like ghosts or vampires, but other people.
100%. The ones you least expect, right? Like in that story, what was it called? From Out of the Night?
Oh, yeah, that one's wild.
It's about these kids camping, right? Telling scary stories.
And then things start to get a little too real. Like, did they really see that creature, or was it just their imaginations running wild?
It's that ambiguity that gets you. The not knowing. It reminds me of this one time, actually. I was camping with some friends, and we swore we heard something out in the woods.
No way. What happened?
Well, we never found out what it was. Probably just an animal or something, but still, it freaked us out.
See, our brains can be our own worst enemies. But speaking of scary things that might or might not be real, there's Till Death Do Us Part. Talk about a different kind of fear.
Oh, man, that one was something else. Like, imagine breaking up with someone, but then they, like, literally never leave you alone, even in death.
It's hilarious and creepy at the same time, like those couples who just can't quit each other, even in the afterlife.
It makes you wonder about all the baggage we carry with us in relationships and just in life, and what happens to it all when we're gone.
Deep thoughts, man. But that's what's so cool about diving into these stories a second time, now that there's this revised edition. It's like Leslie's not just retelling them, he's like engaging with them, adding new layers of meaning.
Right. It's like he's having a conversation with his past self, which, by the way, I'm dying to know, how did you even convince him to revisit these stories after all this time?
It's wild, right? Like going back to something you created years ago, seeing how it's held up, what's changed, what hasn't.
Totally. And sometimes those changes, they can be kind of scary too. Like you realize how much you've grown, how different your perspective is now.
For sure. And Leslie totally gets that. Like, he doesn't shy away from those changes. He embraces them. You can see it in the way he revisits these stories, especially the Shadow Men and Prospero's Ghost. They're like completely new experiences now.
It's like he's adding layers to them, right? Like those layers of meaning you were talking about.
Exactly. He's taking these stories that already messed with our heads and like making them even more complex, more nuanced.
A human, almost.
100%. It's like he's saying, yeah, we might be older now, maybe a little wiser, but those primal fears, those anxieties about the unknown, they never really go away. They just morph. Take the Shadow Men, for example. It's still about that feeling of being watched, hunted, especially in the wilderness.
Oh, God, that feeling. Like something's lurking just beyond the edge of the campfire light. So creepy.
Right. And the way Leslie describes it, the flickering shadows, the hushed tones, it's like he's tapping into something deep in our collective psyche.
Totally. Like we've all been in those situations, whether it's camping or just walking home alone at night. And suddenly, every sound, every shadow seems menacing.
And sometimes those shadows, they represent something real, something even scarier than we could imagine.
Oh, absolutely. Like in Prospero's Ghost.
Right.
Based on a real experience, isn't it?
Yeah. Leslie's talked about how he had this weird encounter in an old theater, something he couldn't explain.
See, that's what gets me, those stories that blur the line between reality and, like, the supernatural. You're left wondering, what if it's true? What if ghosts are real? Or, whatever else goes bump in the night.
Right, and maybe that's the point of it all, to make us question, to make us think about the things that scare us, the things we don't understand.
Exactly. And maybe even to find some kind of, strange beauty in those fears. Because let's face it, there's something kind of fascinating about the dark side,
Totally. And I think that's what makes this deep dive, this exploration of Mark Leslie's work so compelling. It's not just about being scared, it's about confronting those fears, understanding them, and maybe even learning something about ourselves in the process.
Well said. It's like holding up a mirror to our own anxieties, to the things that keep us up at night.
And maybe, just maybe, by facing those fears head on, we can find a way to, if not conquer them, then at least coexist with them.
I think you just summed up the entire human experience in a nutshell. We're all just trying to make sense of the darkness, both inside and out.
And what better way to do that than through the power of story?
So here's another tool that I was just so thrilled to learn about. And this was a gentleman who had contacted me months ago, and I saw it and I didn't really pay attention to it, or I got distracted with a million other things I was doing via LinkedIn, and said, hey, I'd love for you to test this out and try out this new tool. And then, of course, I didn't notice until, that we had this conversation. I was on LinkedIn doing something else. I went, oh my God, I remember that. Yeah, I want to check this out. So we had a meeting. We had a wonderful meeting. We kind of talked through the tools and what they're doing, but they're basically creating some tools that'll automate some of the marketing and some of the promotional aspects and some of the social media aspects for your books. And so they have a bunch of different products. Now, the first product that I'm going to talk to you about and share sort of a sample from, it's called manuscriptreport.com. And you don't need to create an account. You can go in and create something. And it's only $25. That's right, $25. It's your one-stop solution for all your book marketing needs. So you can generate marketing assets for your book in minutes. So it's amazing how much it can do for you in terms of creating, help you with metadata, keywords, target audience, genres, themes, tropes, getting a back of the book summary, a synopsis, sales pitches. Oh my God, sales pitches are so amazing. Press release templates, ad copy, and and comparisons with comp titles and comp authors. This is a magnificent tool for getting all of that. Now, again, you could probably go and use some tools yourself and do this. But training and learning and how to do all this stuff, or in 5 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it is, the time that it takes to load my manuscript, have this spit out to me, and suddenly I have all this content. So I'm going to give you an example of the report that I got back from Manuscript Reports for, again, One Hand Screaming. So obviously it tells you the book length, the ISBN, the publisher, etc., etc. And then here's the summary that got spit out. Dive into the eerie world of One Hand Screaming, where Mark Leslie masterfully blends horror, psychological tension, and dark humor. This collection of tales invites readers to explore the shadowy corners of human nature and the supernatural. Meet Herb, a man whose obsession with collecting skulls of avid readers leads him down a dark path of knowledge and madness. Follow Carl, whose childhood encounter with the Tooth Fairy and the Sandman leaves him haunted by nocturnal fears that seep into his adult life. Experience the chilling atmosphere of a space station party gone awry, where absurdity and horror collide in a deadly dance. Each story in this collection delves into themes of fear, obsession, and the thin line between reality and the supernatural. With vivid imagery and a satirical edge, Leslie crafts narratives that are as unsettling as they are thought-provoking. Whether you're a fan of horror, psychological thrillers, or speculative fiction, One Hand Screaming promises a diverse and haunting reading experience that will linger long after the final page is turned. So that's the summary from this 21-page report. It's kind of cool. I mean, I can see taking several elements from this and actually leveraging it into revising my my book description because it does a better job than I did in trying to put that together. So the synopsis, which is a bit longer, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it starts off with, One Hand Screaming by Mark Leslie is a rich tapestry of horror stories and poems that delve into the depths of human fear and imagination. This collection is not just a series of chilling tales, but a reflection on the author's personal journey with horror. And this is one of the areas where the automated system, because this platform is not meant for story collections, it's meant for novels, etc., or nonfiction books. This is where they kind of got it a little bit wrong. Says, the author's personal journey with horror inspired by a childhood moment with his great Uncle Nathan, which ignited his passion for storytelling. Now, great Uncle Nathan is a character referenced in the first story, the Book Age Skull story that I've talked about before. So, I mean, again, for God's sakes, a radio host, flipping through the book and maybe reading it really fast is probably going to make that same mistake too. So it's really interesting how it does that. So it goes on for about a page and a half there. And then it goes into genres. And this is kind of cool. I'll have a screenshot of this over at starkreflections.ca. So genres, and there's a wheel, a circle with the percentages. So it's got horror, 60%. Psychological thriller, 20%, dark humor, 10%, and speculative fiction, 10%. And that's about right when you actually think about that. But it's looking, obviously, probably at word phrases and all kinds of other complex patterns to get to that. This is so interesting. This is where the themes, it says fear and the unknown. The stories explore primal human fear of the unknown, often manifesting through supernatural elements and eerie settings. Another theme is obsession and madness. Characters frequently grapple with obsessions that lead to madness, reflecting on the lengths individuals might go to attain knowledge or fulfillment. And that comes up in several of the stories that I can tell. The supernatural and reality, the thin line between supernatural and reality is a recurring theme, with characters often confronting ghostly apparitions or surreal experiences. Another theme is isolation and loneliness. Many tales delve into the psychological impact of isolation, highlighting characters' struggles with loneliness and their search for connection. Being needed and false spectacle and erratic cycles definitely are in that realm. Dark humor and irony. The collection often infuses horror with dark humor, providing a satirical edge to the macabre and unsettling narratives. And then it goes into book tropes. So I'm not going to read them all, but just the high level, I'm not going to read the details, but the haunted object, that's a trope I use a lot. The ghostly encounter, yeah. The descent into madness, sure. The campfire tale, yeah. The unseen threat, yeah, for sure. That's a huge one. And then it suggests KDP categories, which, I mean, I already know these things, but if I hadn't published this book yet, that would help me, right? That's fantastic. And then target audience. This is brilliant. One Hand Screaming is a collection of horror and dark stories that blend supernatural elements with psychological tension and dark humor. The target audience for this book includes 1. Fans of horror fiction who enjoy exploring the eerie and unsettling aspects of human nature. 2. Readers interested in psychological thrillers that delve into themes of obsession, madness, and the supernatural. 3. Individuals who appreciate dark humor and irony in storytelling, offering a satirical take on traditional horror tropes. 4. Those who enjoy speculative fiction that blurs the line between reality and the supernatural, providing thought-provoking narratives. Okay, authors often struggle with target audience. This is a great way to get you into thinking about that. Now, here are some sales pitches. Like these sales pitches blew my mind. Dive into One Hand Screaming, where Mark Leslie masterfully blends horror, dark humor, and psychological tension. Experience tales that explore the eerie and unsettling aspects of human nature. Perfect for fans of the supernatural and those who appreciate a satirical twist on fear. And then there's other ones like Unravel the Mysteries of One Hand Screaming, a chilling collection. So you'll notice the pitches are geared towards the various themes, etc., or the various readers. The next one starts off with Explore the Depths of Fear and Obsession. And then the other one is Mark Leslie's One Hand Screaming invites you into a world where horror meets dark humor, where tales of obsession, madness, and the supernatural. This collection is perfect for those who relish exploring the darker side of human nature with a satirical edge. So again, you've got sales pitches now broken down by audience, fans of horror fiction, readers interested in psychological thrillers, dark humor, spec fic. And then you have SEO keywords. It has a whole string of main keywords, long tail keywords, ad-specific keywords, genre-specific keywords, character-driven keywords, plot keywords, theme keywords, process keywords. So fantastic. And then it has comparisons. So it compares this book to some other titles. Book title, My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. It talks about the similarities. Both books explore horror themes with a mix of dark humor and introspection, focusing on the psychological aspects of fear. The difference is Jones' novel is a slasher horror with a strong narrative focus, while Leslie's collection is a mix of short stories and poems. Again, Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And both books, fellow Canadian, by the way, both books incorporate dark themes in a reflective tone with a focus on character development and psychological depth. And then the differences are Moreno Garcia's book is a noir thriller set in a historical context, while Leslie's is a horror collection with supernatural elements. Grady Hendrix, The Final Girl Support Group. Both books feature horror elements with a mix of dark humor. And so it goes on and shares these things. And then it does narrative crossroads. So here's a comparison narrative crossroad. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark meets The Twilight Zone in a darkly humorous collection. It goes on and there's a couple paragraphs about what sets it apart. While One Hand Screaming shares the chilling narratives and supernatural elements with its counterparts, it stands out with its introspective and reflective tone, offering a personal glimpse into the author's journey and the evolution of his writing. Unlike the straightforward horror of Scary Stories and the often abstract Twilight Zone, Leslie's collection delves into the psychological horror and dark comedy, providing a fresh take on macabre literature. Why you can't miss it if you're drawn to psychological thriller. So it goes on. And then there's another one, American Horror Story meets Black Mirror in a collection of supernatural and psychological tales. Genius! Anyway, so it goes on and it gives me... And then the next one is The Haunting of Hill House meets Goosebumps. And right, so it gives you tons of ideas that you can leverage in the marketing of your book. And I was like, man, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do this before I launched the book? Sales copy. Uncover the Macabre Mysteries of One Hand Screaming by Mark Leslie. And it goes on and it gives me the sales copy. And then there's even a sample press release. Unveiling the Shadows. Mark Leslie's One Hand Screaming delivers a haunting blend of horror and dark humor. And it wrote a really solid press release that probably is better than the one I sent out and that I wrote. So I'm probably going to go and revise this. And then some of the other stuff that it created for me, and this, again, this blows my mind, is... I have to find it in the folder here because I created a special folder, new folder for marketing materials. And so this is one of the other tools that came out of it. This is social media content. and recent comps. So there's two other documents, and again, it's from a parallel service that's provided by the same folks. And so what I have is in the social media post, which is amazing. I have a tab with sales pitches, and it says, audience, fans of horror fiction. And the post text says, step through the looking glass into a world where reality bends and breaks. One hand screaming will challenge your perception and leave you questioning what's real. The next one for fans of horror fiction is brace yourself for a tidal wave of supernatural terror. Mark Leslie's stories will submerge you in a world where the impossible becomes horrifyingly real. So again, 140 characters, right, for each of these sections so they can share on social media. It goes fans of horror fiction, individuals who appreciate dark humor. I have 16 different pitches, short pitches that I could share on social media. So if I'm looking for stuff to post, then there's scene spotlights, right? So the scene spotlights may be lost in the depths of northern Ontario's wilderness where the highway meets an endless sea of trees. As night falls, the forest looms closer, shadows deepening, stars piercing the sky. But in this isolation, old fears resurface. What lurks beyond the tree line? The bush people of childhood nightmares, or something more sinister. And bam, hashtag one hand screaming, hashtag Northern Ontario, hashtag isolation horror. Again, I have another, oh my God, so 25 potential things I can use to talk about this on social media. And then, again, which is something people do on TikTok and things like that, there's quotes pulled from the book. And it tells you where in the manuscript they're pulled from. So, this one here, which you heard, silent screams bounce around inside my head like an impending storm. Bam, there's one. There's another one, again, quote from the book. We can never truly return home or to a cherished past. It's as impossible as returning to a state before our innocence was lost. All right, cool. Another one is reach out beyond the grave and touch someone. I think that was a cheeky, humorous thing I was doing. And, he was dead, yet still standing, rigid like a stone statue. Of course, the next quote is, hell is empty and all the devils are here. That's my Shakespearean character quoting Shakespeare, Shakespeare's ghost, or a professor, Shakespearean professor quoting Shakespeare, speaking in Shakespeare's words. So that was actually Shakespeare, not me, who wrote that, but still a cool quote. And yeah, so there's some really great, like the opening line from the Nocturnal, to one of my, I should know the names of my stories. Oh, what the heck is the name of this? See, now I have to look it up. It's embarrassing. So this is Nocturnal something or other, isn't it? What the heck is the name of the story? It is Nocturnal Visions. Oh, wow. I can't believe this. I messed that up. But anyway, the opening line to Nocturnal Visions is, when Carl was 6 years old, he watched the Sandman strangle the Tooth Fairy. And again, another line from one of my campfire stories is, somewhere masked within the sad, mournful, unearthly, half-laughing, half-wailing cry of a loon, I can hear my brother warning me that the shadow men are near. And so, yeah, just amazing when you look at this. And so then the next bit of information you can get is this is a spreadsheet of recent comps. And so this is comp titles that are published within the last X period of time. And it just, a comp title is titles that bookstores and libraries use when they're trying to want to promote the book. So I'm not as familiar with these books, so I have to go look them up. But so, for example, it says title, pre-approved for haunting, author, Patrick Barb. The publisher is Turner Publishing Company. And the description, it gives me a description, a collection of weird dark stories and millennial anxieties. In this new collection, Patrick Barb explores themes of family, found and lost, etc. So it goes on, it gives me a bit of a summary. When it was published, so it was published 2023, September 26th. It gives me the ISBN, it gives me the URL to find this on Goodreads. And the reasoning is, it says, both One Hand Screaming and Pre-Approved for Haunting share significant thematic overlap, exploring horror, the supernatural, and psychological tension. They delve into, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes on and on. I mean, it's just such an amazing way for me to mine marketing material for my books. So I love the fact that this can help save me a significant amount of time. There's, so many other descriptions as to why, and there's another book from Penguin, Dead 11, and why it's a comp title, The Girl in the House, a psychological thriller. So again, and I'd never heard of these books. Well, I've heard of the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2001 and why my collection might appeal to someone there. But this is some useful information that I could pull out and I can provide in a one sheet that I send to libraries or bookstores, or even use when I'm sending out press releases and reviews. So I know I've babbled on for a long time and I shared a lot of information. It was very self-indulgent, but I hope it was useful for you to hear some of these tools. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Stark Reflections podcast. I want to thank you so much for listening, so much for letting me scream in your ear. one mouth screaming into one ear or two ears, as the case may be. Depends, right, on where and how you're listening to this. And I will be back after some more travel, after doing the book launch in Ottawa at the Spaniel's Tail bookstore, independent bookstore. Again, the bookstore is normally closed in the evenings, but they're opening up just for my event. And it's a really interesting contract I signed with them. So I'm on the hook to pay them $200. Because they have to pay their staff to be there, right? Because they're normally, they close at 5 o'clock. They're going to be open from 6 to 9 o'clock that evening for an event that I'm doing there. But if I sell a particular amount of books, I do not have to pay. And that's a great deal. So it's kind of like, I've done a lot of events as a bookseller, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of organizational skills. So I should be on the hook for something. If they have to pay their staff, if they have to, even be there themselves, they have to compensate for their time, etc. And being there, they may as well be compensated for it. But this also encourages the author who wants to use the bookstore to bring in enough people to sell enough books for that event. So I love the fact that I've got this sort of additional pressure to get it done, because the reminder, this is an important reminder. And again, I'm popping back into reflection, but hey, my podcast, I can do what I want. But think about this, this is something I try to remind authors about all the time, is a bookstore is a business. A library is a business. So the bookstore needs to sell books in order to stay open and pay the bills and pay their staff, etc. And a library needs the books on the shelves to actually be checked out by patrons, or else they're going to get rid of them and bring in books that patrons want. So it's not just, carry my book because you should carry it. No, carry my book because it's going to sell. And then, so the last thing, because again, hey, why not add an extra reflection to help you? The last thing I've done is I've gone on to this indie bookstore, and you can do this with a US tool as well, like IndieBound, and I think a bookshop may even show you stock of bookstores as well. But I have this Shop Indie for Canadian bookstores, and you can put in an ISBN and you can see on order or stock on hand. And I basically saw that Wordsworth Books, my local bookstore, I was going there anyways to pick up books that I purchased from them, some of my TriedPub titles that they give me a discount on. And I went in and I asked them, I said, hey, you've got my book on the shelf. Is it okay if I sign some copies? And then the cashier's like, yeah, of course. And then she said, well, come on over here and I'll take some pictures of you signing them. So I have pictures of me signing the books in the store. I have pictures of where they are in the store. I have a picture of the outside of the store. And in my social media, I tagged Wordsworth Books and said, hey, Wordsworth Books has signed copies of my books. Go get them, people. And I plan on, as I travel over the next few weeks, making a point, even if it's a half hour or an hour drive out of my way, I'm going to stop in, swing by, introduce myself to the bookseller, thank them for carrying my book, ask them if there's anything I can do to help promote them, and is it okay if I sign my books and I want to share on social media, like do you have a hashtag, or either hashtag, or are you on Instagram or whatever, and can I tag you, because I want to send people to buy them at your store, because if they are successful with the book, then I'm successful with the book. And of course, in this particular case, I don't get the returns back, because that is a risk that I'm taking. But in any case, all right, I promise, well, I'm not going to promise, but I'll try really hard not to reflect anymore. But I want to thank you for listening to this episode. Like I said, I'm going to be in Ottawa. I'm going to be traveling when this episode comes out. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun for me to put this together. But until next week, and until next episode, this is, as always, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, wishing you, dear listener, great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.